thank you everybody for, I don't know if you tune into Zoom or Zoom into Zoom or whatever you do, but thank you for being with us this morning. And thank you, Maya Wiley, for being with us and the other candidates. And very much want to thank Courtney Gross, who's our moderator today. Courtney Gross is, of course, from New York One and is one of the reporters really in the country who has spent the most time focusing on issues of poverty and poor New Yorkers and the racism and discrimination they face and how that is really built into our system. So when we thought about doing this forum, there was no one who jumped ahead in line in our thoughts ahead of Courtney Gross. So thank you for this, but Courtney, thank you for covering the New Yorkers that so many people look away from and try to forget, and you make sure that that does not happen. So thank you very much. And I should have said this to start. My name is Christine Quinn, and I am the president and CEO of WIN, Women in Need. We are New York City's largest provider of shelter and supportive housing to homeless families with children in the 5 boroughs. And I'd like to welcome you all to the Forum on Family Homelessness and Poverty. And we're very happy to be coordinating this with Advocates for Children, one of our leading advocacy groups in this city to help children on an array of different issues. I've worked with them both in and out of government, and no one, aside from WIN, is better than they are. Believe it or not, there's 5 weeks until we select our next mayor. So we're here today because New York City continues to have a systemic problem of racism and inequality that hits Black New Yorkers and Latinx New Yorkers the hardest. And one of the ways it plays out is through housing instability and poverty in the 5 boroughs. You know, on any given night during this pandemic, there were more than 9,000 families sleeping in bare bones city-funded shelter units. I don't say bare bones because we do a bad job or because we're not giving clients what we have and we could. I say bare bones because the city is not funding our work on an adequate level. And I want to put a picture in your mind. Every night during the pandemic, there were more children in shelter than there are seats in the Barclays Center. When the first people go into Barclays for 100% capacity game or concert, think that all of those people, they're fewer than the number of children living in shelter. This forum is an opportunity for voters to learn what our candidates are planning and thinking about how to end the family homeless crisis in New York City. We'll hear today from Maya Wiley, Kathryn Garcia, and Andrew Yang. And I'm now going to turn it over to Courtney Gross so we can hear from our first candidate, Maya Wiley. So thank you all for being with us today. And please feel free to share these conversations as widely and broadly as you possibly can. We need to make sure that homeless families, particularly homeless children who can't vote, are a deciding factor in who our next mayor is. Thank you all.
Okay, can you all hear me? Okay, Chris, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I really appreciate that. Obviously, it's so important, I think, to focus on the very sprawling system that is our homeless shelter system throughout this city, and it's a somewhat undercovered area, and it's incredibly important to give these families the voice that they need and deserve in this mayor's race, which is obviously hotly contested. And we have our first candidate here with us this morning, Maya Wiley. So I just want to jump right in, Maya, if you don't mind, with our first question, and that is, for many families in shelter, housing instability isn't something new. Shelter stay is often one stop in a very long struggle of low-paying jobs, inadequate childcare options, housing that is obviously not affordable in the 5 boroughs, and other larger forces that make it nearly impossible to achieve housing stability. I know that in my coverage of homelessness in New York City, there were many times when I'm speaking to a family who may be on the brink of shelter now, who was also in shelter 5 years ago. And it's very common to hear families go in and out of the system. So with that in mind, as mayor, how will you address the long-term reoccurring nature of homelessness and housing instability that so many low-income families and children find themselves experiencing in the city?
Well, thank you for that, Courtney. And also thank you for this forum, because it's an incredibly important one. You know, as someone who's the child of civil rights activists, with a father who actually moved from civil rights activism to economic justice, it was because the rights-based movement wasn't solving the systemic problems of poverty for Black people in this country. And he focused on women on welfare for a reason. And it was because it was women on welfare that were not only unseen, but they were at the root of what essentially is both racism intertwined with sexism that continues to create and recreate poverty. And I say that because it was that upbringing that sent me to law school. And it's why I became a civil rights lawyer. But it's also why I focused on systemic racism, structural racism, because essentially what we're talking about here is that people do not live single issue lives. Homelessness is an eviction crisis, which is a housing affordability crisis, which is a jobs crisis, which is an education crisis. Once you start linking all those things, what we're really saying is we have to fix what's broken. And one of the things that's in the WINS report that called my attention right away and that I thought was so important was to say, you know, government has the ability to solve these problems, but it has to make it its goal. So I've actually got several prongs of my plan. One, which is to say, we do need to recognize that we have to bring all the resources of government to bear and do it in partnership. So one, that's creating jobs that are jobs with a future, and focusing those jobs in communities that have the highest rates of unemployment, and creating workforce development programs that link to those jobs. So I'm going to double the capital construction budget of this city so that we're building things we need built, like more affordable housing that people can actually afford, but putting people to work and getting them into jobs pipelines for the jobs we're creating who need them the most. That's actually using more of a structural lens to the problem and looking at communities with all their needs in mind. But it's also childcare, because we know that childcare is also one of the top 3 costs of living in the city. And there's simply not enough support for particularly women who are single heads of households, taking care of children, and also sometimes elderly family members. So it's more subsidy for care. We've got $5,000 in care grants to families. That will include families who are undocumented, starting with 100,000 of the neediest families. We think we can build it from there, but that's where we're starting with where we see the money. But also making sure that we're creating community drop-off centers for care so that they're both creating care jobs. So many of the women we know who are in shelter are also in the care economy. They're care providers. They can't actually support their own families. This is about also supporting those who support us with jobs, but also with the care they need. And trauma-informed care. You know, the WIN report is very explicit about this. And this is powerful to me as a trauma survivor, but also recognizing so much about what I've seen around this city for folks who are in trouble, which is the fact that their trouble is mental health, and that we haven't addressed it and we haven't recognized it as a core part of the problem. Mental health is health. So this means providing trauma-informed care. And I'm going to start in our schools, and particularly in our schools that have high rates of vulnerability. But we're going to make sure all our schools are getting social worker, that we're expanding psychologists. There's more we will do and must do. But this is a multi-pronged approach, and it does require government actually being de-siloed. It requires government having a bigger, bolder, more transformational goal that's explicit about ending homelessness. we are putting out our plan on housing, but let's be honest, it's a housing first plan,
Okay,
but it's
just to
also one that
follow,
recognizes the whole family. Sorry.
I'm going to just stop you there to follow up on some of what you said there. You mentioned jobs for homeless families as well as affordable apartments for homeless families. Some of the debate we've had over the last couple of years in this city is whether there should be set asides. So in your affordable housing plan, have you set aside a certain number of units for homeless families? In addition, the jobs that you want to create, would you ensure that perhaps homeless families get to the front of the line? How do you prioritize this particular group specifically?
Yeah, I think what part of what we're looking at is needs-based approach, right? Because that's why we're both looking geographically at the parts of the city that are hardest hit by COVID. Because look, the parts of the city that are hardest hit by COVID are also the parts of the city that have the highest rates of housing insecurity, of job loss, of hunger, and that all predated COVID and housing overcrowded, housing insecurity. So part of what we're recognizing is, first of all, there is a geography to our problem, and that one of the approaches of government has to be bringing a all resources approach and a partnership approach. That's government partnering with itself, but also partnering with communities. So we're looking at communities of concern as places for holistic investment. And yes, that includes family. We have to end homelessness. That is an explicit goal of our housing policy. And that means we're looking at every lever of government and all the partnerships we need to expand the services. And let's just be very explicit. It is a multi-pronged approach. So that's everything from the affordable housing we create. It's for the partnerships around creating more affordability. It's public housing and making sure we're getting the 5,000 units that are currently out of circulation, no one living in them, rehabilitated. But it's also making sure that we're utilizing vacancy, but partnering with our homeless services providers to make the services work, because it is trauma-informed care. It is changing the subsidy structure so that we're both preventing homelessness in the first place by increasing subsidy, but it's also making sure that we're recognizing we need to use subsidies to keep people in housing. So it's going to be all those approaches together.
So I want to move to a different area of this topic, and that is education. I think when the pandemic hit us last year, more than a year ago, it really exacerbated the problems that we saw in our Department of Education, in our New York City public schools, when it comes to homeless children, children in shelters at the moment, trying to still get the same level of education that other children across the city receive on a 5-day-a-week basis. So only 29% of students experiencing homelessness in grades 3 through 8 were reading proficiently in 2019, 20% percentage points lower than the rate of their permanently housed peers. And only 61% of students who are homeless graduate high school in 4 years. Only 61%. That's a very astounding number. 18 percentage points lower than students who are permanently housed. There are even greater disparities for students living in shelters specifically. How would you work across multiple city agencies involved in the lives of families experiencing homelessness to design and implement policies to improve these outcomes?
Ooh, this is such an important question. I'm going to start with the broadband focus for now, just because that was one of the things that we saw in COVID that was an avoidable tragedy, right? Which is the fact that kids couldn't even get online to get an education because it converted to online. And we have a connectivity crisis in the city with 1.8 million New Yorkers not being connected. That's also a long-term structural problem for opportunity in many ways. But here's the point. When I was in city government, I had to de-silo government because I had broadband access as a policy area of mine. And there was no single agency called the Universal Broadband Agency. It was getting more than 4 agencies to the table, constructing the goal. And one of the things we did is we got every single apartment in Queensbridge houses free broadband. We had the capability to do that for kids in homeless shelters. Now, that's not all the problem, but I'm saying that because that's something that I saw a pathway to and would have leaned hard into during the crisis, but it's one that's a continuing crisis. But it's also recognizing that You know, there's so many things we do that torture homeless kids and families, and we should be really honest about that. I have people in my life who I love who have been traumatized by the experience of homelessness. And one of them is we make parents drag their kids to the appointments, languishing sometimes all day, waiting to see case managers, pulling them out of school to do that. We have to change that. But we also have to recognize that we have to bring down class sizes, particularly in pre-K and in K through 5 education, because so much of the supports and services we need and for children, particularly children who have other vulnerabilities, teachers, we need more teachers so that they can better support and do individualized learning for those kids. But also, so that I'm hiring 2,500 teachers focused on bringing class sizes down for that reason. But it's also to create wraparound support services, better identify, create student support teams in schools that better identify all the services required for students and their families in order to create more educational success. And for families who are experiencing homelessness, it is making sure there's trauma-informed care, as I said, I'm going to put in the schools, and all the connective services and supports necessary to ensure there's adequate nutrition, to ensure that if there's a domestic violence issue, that that's being addressed, to ensure that there's also the creation of supports for job opportunities for the parents. We forget that when the parents can't support themselves, children suffer too. So we have to treat the family as a whole unit, but creating this community school model and community school support teams with trauma-informed care is going to be a big part of that in my administration.
So we want to make sure that you actually hear from people who are in shelter at the moment or had previously experienced shelter. So I believe we have a question teed up. Larita Phelps, who is a resident of a family homeless shelter in Queens. Liv, I think you can tee that up.
Hi, good day. My name is Larita Phelps. I am a 43-year-old single mom of 3 wonderful children, and we just so happen to reside in a WIN shelter here in Queens. It's great that New York City has created the voucher program to help families move out of the shelters and into their own homes or houses or apartments, I should say, whichever may become their home. But I've also noticed that landlords, whether they just don't understand the voucher program or have had bad experiences, they won't take them. They don't accept the vouchers because they don't feel that we could pay the rent. And I have had access to the City for HEP's voucher program on and off for years, but it's really nearly impossible to find anything for $1,580, which is the highest that my voucher has been in New York City. So because I know this and I've looked for so long with no success, my question to you as mayor, or as future mayor, I should say, how will you fix this program so that my family can actually use this voucher, as well as future families can use the voucher to be able to move into a home from the shelter system?
Mm-hmm. That is such an important question and a clear problem, and one with a solution. And it's a multi-pronged solution, like they always are. So first, we have to increase the subsidy for the FEPS program. It is simply too low. It should at minimum mirror Section 8. That is going to be in my housing platform. It's something I've been talking about since the beginning of this race. But secondly, we have to recognize, and as a civil rights lawyer, I know, and as the person to whom the city's Civil and Human Rights Commission reported, we have income and source of payment discrimination in the city. And so we have to beef up both the relationship and partnerships with landlords to make sure they know and understand the program and that the city is behind it. And that it's meaningful and that it's reliable. And we have to also ensure that we're enforcing our own city human rights laws, which actually make this discriminatory and unlawful. And third, we have to do and expand what works, which is free legal assistance for housing. This is a program that has substantially reduced evictions in this city when a resident has access to attorney by over 80%. We have to continue that, but I'm going to increase it to 400% of poverty because we're facing a massive eviction crisis if we don't get on top of both recognizing we have to keep people in homes by increasing the vouchers and allowing them to be supportive of folks staying in their homes, but also increasing the vouchers so folks who are in shelters can get homes, but also making sure we're enforcing the law and having all the right partnerships. Because if I've learned one thing in my life, it is that if you're not listening to the people who are impacted by the problem, you're not going to solve it, because you're not understanding where things are broken, where government is falling down, and where we have to improve it. And so that is a commitment.
Speaking of listening to the people, so I want to give one more opportunity for one more of WIN client, WIN resident who is in supportive housing, I believe in Brooklyn, Heidi Kinney live. I think we need that question. If we still have, I think we have a little bit of time, Maya, if you don't mind just keeping your answer a little bit shorter on this last
Sorry.
one. Thank you. No worries. Thank you.
My name is Heidi Kinney. I'm 43 years old and I live in supportive housing in Brooklyn with my 3 children. The next mayor of New York City must be a leader for everyone, but it often feels like families in a shelter are forgotten. Many shelters aren't prepared or equipped to help children with special needs or adults battling diseases like Alzheimer's or dementia. My son is autistic. We moved into supportive housing. We had many difficulties while living in a shelter. As mayor, what will you do to help families like mine?
And I'm sorry I'm being lengthy in answers. I'm going to try to be brief. It's
no,
just
no worries. 60 seconds. I'm going to give you 60 seconds and that's it.
Important questions. But one is more supportive housing so that we have on-site services for all the needs of families. 2, our community-based drop-off centers so that there's also quality care, both for childcare and elder care, that recognizes and supports the needs so that also people who are supporting their families can do what they need to do and also know they're getting the care. And the student support teams I'm creating in schools are explicitly to help identify the special needs, including of our children, to make sure their needs are getting met, with the community-based support teams to also do wraparound services for the families.
Thank you, Maya. We really appreciate you coming and talking about this very important issue that affects obviously thousands of New Yorkers that will indeed be going to the polls potentially next month, just in a few weeks. So good luck. We'll see you on the campaign trail. Thank you again.
Thank you, Courtney, and thank you for this forum. Appreciate you all.
And I believe we have our next candidate coming up, who is Kathryn Garcia. I don't see her yet, but she should, I think, be coming up. Why don't I see you? Let's see. There you are. I see you. Okay. For those who don't know who Kathryn Garcia is, she is the former sanitation commissioner. At one point, she served as the interim chair to the New York City Public Housing Authority. She served in the Bloomberg and de Blasio administration. So that is my very concise intro for Kathryn Garcia there. And I want to just hop right in to talk about these very important issues. And we obviously appreciate you joining us this morning. So first, let's talk about homeless children experiencing homelessness in the public school system. Students in shelter have had the lowest attendance rate of any student group this school year, with attendance well below the citywide rate. That shouldn't surprise anyone, obviously, with the challenges that the last year have really brought to not only public school children in permanent homes, but obviously in homelessness as well. And even before the pandemic, more than half of students in shelter were chronically absent, missing at least 1 out of every 10 school days. If elected mayor, what would you do to improve the attendance rates of students in shelter to ensure they get to school on a regular basis?
Again, for all of our kids, but particularly for homeless children, this has just been an unbelievably horrifying year. And in my plan to end homelessness is also that we need to have more resources in the 140 schools that have 20% of homeless children. And that means not only the educational push and the art and the music and the science, but also practical things. Like, is there a washer and dryer that we can make available to these families so that that is part of their community focus? But we really need to get to the core of having people get into permanent homes and not languish in shelters when they are ready to be housed. And making that transition more quickly is at the heart of my plan to end homelessness.
Let's talk a little bit more, or go a little bit deeper into your plan to end homelessness. Obviously, for decades, candidates have talked about ending homelessness. They've pledged to end homelessness. I remember when Mike Bloomberg in 2005 promised to end family homelessness. And we know that this is a really sprawling system throughout all of city government. You've had a lot of experience in city government, so I'm assuming you know it pretty well. With all the different agencies that focus on developing affordable housing, managing the shelter system, providing social services, and administering government benefits, how do you think this system is working at the moment? And then how do you think the system is not working? And specifically, what would you do to fix the not working part?
Absolutely. So the first and fundamental problem is we focus on shelter and not on permanent housing, and particularly for families, which make up anywhere from 65 to 70% of people who are unhoused. This is fundamentally often a poverty problem. And doing things like making the voucher that we provide somewhat near what it costs to rent an apartment, so closer to the Section 8 value, because you can't rent an apartment on, or I don't think anybody can rent an apartment on what we provide. So it's sort of, here's something nice that you can't actually use anywhere. But it's also aligning government. The Department of Homeless Services does not even sit under the same deputy mayor as the deputy mayor responsible for creating affordable housing and creating supportive housing and managing NYCHA and making sure that those apartments that become vacant are then transferred over to a family who is in a shelter. Getting everyone at the same place so that we are all focused on ending homelessness and getting people into housing is how I would reorganize it.
I'm not sure if you were on when we played the question from Loretta Phelps, who is a woman in a family homelessness shelter in Queens, I believe. But she did talk about the voucher problem. It's something that I feel like we've all been talking about for years. And a lot of the mayoral candidates have committed to increasing the voucher program. There's been legislation at the city council languishing for years. So you said Section 8 levels, but the de Blasio administration has said time and again that they don't want the voucher they don't want to go out and increase it on their own without the state's help, because then you have two separate systems of a state voucher that's not worth as much as a city voucher. How would you solve that problem? And do you think the city in this moment of fiscal crisis can afford an more expensive voucher, which some people, especially the administration, said would cost hundreds of millions of dollars more every year?
And Ms. Phelps said it's a powerful story to say, I've given you something, but it's not useful. And we have to be listening to whether or not the programs that are designed for you actually work for you. And saying we're going to wait on the state is just silly and bad for our budget. We are spending $400 million on hotels for families, and we're spending over $3 billion on the homeless situation. Getting people into housing in the long run is actually fiscally responsible. It literally will pay for itself because families will be able to access education, get back on their feet, and have access to more employment opportunities. Housing really heals and is the best investment we can make for these families.
Can we actually go live to hear from Ms. Phelps again? We played her first question for Maya Wiley. Let's play her second question for Kathryn Garcia, if we have that teed up.
I have spent the pandemic living here in shelter, and it's been a very difficult time. And it's been a very difficult time on me and my children, mainly mentally and emotionally. And I've had to be strong for my family, though it's not always been an easy journey. And it oftentimes feels like shelters they just don't seem to understand what it's like to be a survivor in need of support. and to address the trauma many of us have faced in our lives, and to have access to job training programs and opportunities that can just help us move forward. As mayor, what will you do to help families like my own, parents, and especially the single parents, whether a single dad or single mom, such as myself?
Kathryn, you can go ahead.
We have all seen the trauma, but for homeless families, the trauma of the last year has been significant. There's so much learning loss for kids. There is so much, actually emotional loss. We know that we have to have mental health services in all of our schools for these children, but we also need to make sure that our public clinics for mental health are able to address parents' problems, but give them also optimism. You want to make sure that you are providing people with job training. They want to succeed, but in order, usually for single parents and particularly moms, if you have very young children, you need childcare. And that is why in my plan for parents who make under $70,000 a year, there would be free childcare. It is almost the same type of infrastructure as you need to get to work on a subway. You can't go to work if you don't have some place where you know your child is going to be safe.
I think a lot of families would probably want to hear that, as they are in desperate need of free childcare, and that's certainly an issue that we've heard a lot about on the campaign trail. I want to take a broader approach to your plan right now. I know on the campaign trail for the last couple of months, we've heard many candidates talk about eliminating shelters. I remember Sean Donovan saying that he's going to get rid of the shelter system in its entirety, I think, or congregate shelter by the end of his first term if he were to be elected. I know you had an announcement yesterday about homelessness. So with all the talk of trying to get away from the traditional shelter system that we've become so used to over the last many decades, what is your plan to either transition everyone to permanent housing? Do you think that's even possible? How do you envision the shelter system under a Garcia administration?
First and foremost, we have to identify that these are different problems in different areas, and their different solutions are required. Family homelessness is very different than single adult homelessness, and you need different approaches and services. At the core of this is to build 10,000 units of supportive housing, 50,000 units of affordable housing, deeply affordable, $30,000 incomes or less, to make it so that we do the rehabs at NYCHA under the Blueprint program and get those apartments back in circulation. They take an incredibly long time at a vacancy to make it ready for a new family, an incredibly long time. That has to be a priority, but it is also about letting the private market manage some of this, because we know that if we increase the voucher, then people can go rent an apartment of their own in the neighborhood that they want to live in. That's actually probably the easiest thing to solve. It doesn't require new construction. It is just about having the resources available to these families. But beyond that, we need to build more across the city. We've been in a scarcity model where supply and demand has been in a mismatch for like 70 plus years. This means making it so that we legalize 2 and 3 family homes and indiscriminatory zoning, that we allow accessory dwellings to become legalized, basements to become legalized. We need the supply to get bigger.
Do you think that the traditional shelter model will something that will continue to exist as we know it now?
The traditional shelter model has to be moved away from. There's going to be a moment where you come into the system and there's not immediately an apartment, but this has to be quick, like 30 days, you are into a permanent apartment. And sometimes now people are languishing for months to years in the shelter system. That is not what it was ever designed to do, and terrible for families.
How long do you think it would change, or how long would it take to implement that kind of massive change? Because what you're talking about is potentially a massive change to turn something that has basically become semi-permanent housing or permanent housing, a shelter for so many homeless families, to a much more temporary emergency model. And can you only do it by just increasing the amount of the voucher?
It is about making sure that we increase the amount of, that is the biggest piece, and supporting those families with other resources that may be required, so that not only do they get the apartment, they keep the apartment. Like they get a job, their kid gets into school. Really straightforward investments in those families will make the difference. That is where we can really fundamentally make change, and make change quickly. Uh, I have front loaded all of the construction and conversions that I want to do to create more affordable housing, to move as quickly as possible in that direction. But at the core of this is a financial infusion for those families to get them on their feet, get them going again, and protect those kids.
I want to go back to, for my last question, and then we'll have Ms. Phelps have the last word. But for my last question, I want to go back to the topic of education. I know we talked about truancy or being absent, and how often children are absent, but it's not only an absentee issue, but it's also an education issue as well. We talked to Maya Wiley about this as well, where some of the statistics that we have are only 29% of students experiencing homelessness in grades 3 through 8 were reading proficiently in 2019, which is 20 percentage points lower than students who are stably housed. And then 61% of students who are homeless graduate high school in 4 years, which is 18 percentage points lower than those who are stably housed. So what is your response to those really alarming statistics? And what do you actually do to make sure that children who are in homeless shelters, temporarily or otherwise, are actually getting the education that they need?
So this is where, when you say you've got to move away from a shelter system, the cascading impacts of being in the shelter system for children are just absolutely terrible. But DOE has got to do a better job of keeping track of where these children are. This is why I want to make investments in the schools that have the highest percentage of homeless children, but also giving those kids real supports, both from a mental health perspective and for an educational perspective. They can't be out 1 out of every 10 days. Like, that is just completely insane. No wonder they're not on grade level. They're missing a ton of school. This is where we know that we have to be on our job, keeping track of these kids and not letting them get moved around, not moving and bouncing from school to school or needing to be at appointments. This is the wrong approach. But this is also why housing is so important fundamentally to dealing with things so we don't have to fix the problem on the back end. If we had gotten them the apartment on the front end, we wouldn't have them not graduating from high school on the back end.
And I think we do have time for Ms. Phelps' last question. So Liv, if you could play that for us, that would be great.
I'm a proud mom of my son, Bruce, who's actually a 19-year-old who just finished his first freshman year semester at Clark Atlanta University. And he's worked so very hard to get there. You know, we're doing everything that we can to make sure that he succeeds. And, you know, we've been blessed with some sponsors and some help, but there are many kids like him who live in the shelter system who aren't succeeding in our city schools. You know, studies even show that I've seen or I've heard that more than 100,000 New York City students will just spend a part of the school year in homelessness. And my question is, what will you do as mayor to make sure that all children in the shelter systems are learning and reaching their fullest potential?
It's slightly redundant given what we just talked about, but if you could address her question as well, that'd be great.
And congratulations to her on how well her son is doing, in overcoming all these barriers that we have thrown up in his way. Being invested in these children is critical for their future success, and DOE can do a far better job. And so having people who you know are accountable to those kids, in particularly those schools where we know that there's over 20%, and tracking them, having people invested in their future success makes people step up. But first and foremost, they've got to get into a permanent home. And getting into a permanent home makes all of the other things possible around your education, but whatever they need the support on, whether or not it's as simple as we need a washer and dryer in the school, or we need to make sure that they have the laptop to do their work at home, that we have identified their teachers that are going to be connected with them and checking in. You know, one of the scary things is we were a school system sort of beyond just the topic of homeless that was educating over 1 million children a year. Enrollment for next year is sub 1 million. You know, we're at like 900 plus thousand. We seem to be missing a tremendous number of kids. And that is a deeply concerning because they are primarily homeless children.
Liv, do we have time for one more, or do you think with that is a wrap? I'm gonna wait to see if I get a text message. If I still have you, then I might as well ask you one more question. And I think that's just about the shelter system in general. We've talked about making it more of an emergency system and not a permanent system. How do you think your plan differs from what we saw under your old boss, under Mayor de Blasio? He obviously came out just a number of years ago talking about building 90 new homeless shelters all across the city to ensure that people are housed in the communities in which they came from, that they're around their neighbors. So do you think that that is just a program that you just throw at the wayside, you throw it out, you toss it out, and you don't necessarily complete it?
Yeah, that's a tremendous number of resources that couldn't we just focus on getting people into permanent homes? Isn't that a far better use of the money that we have, rather than trying to build a whole bunch of things that the families don't want to live in because they want a permanent home. We should stop offering things people don't want. We should actually offer them what they do want, which is a permanent home. And it's far less expensive to do that with a voucher.
Okay. Thank you, Kathryn. We really appreciate you coming and talking to us about this incredibly important issue today. Be well, and we'll see you on, well, I know I will see you on the campaign trail in some way, shape, or form sometime soon. Okay, so we're going to move on, and that is going to be, thanks, Kathryn. So we're going to move on, and unfortunately, Andrew Yang could not be with us today live this morning, but we did have a conversation with him yesterday, and we're going to play some of that tape now. Andrew Yang, thank you so much for being here. We know that the campaign trail is obviously very, very busy nowadays. You're jumping from event to event. We obviously see you. I've seen you on the campaign trail many days. So we just want to jump in, and we're glad you're taking the time to talk with us and those that are watching this forum on family homelessness, because it's such an important issue and obviously going to be such a big challenge facing the next mayor. So we have some questions for you. The first, let's just take a look at what your broad plan is for family homelessness. You know, over the past few decades, New York City has developed a sprawling system of helping homeless families with different agencies that focus on developing affordable housing or managing the shelter system, and then also providing social services as well, and administering government benefits. So how do you think the system is working? What is your critique of it? What would you keep, or what would you throw out? And generally, how do you think that the city or Yang administration would approach the topic of family homelessness?
Well, first, thank you to the work that WIN and the other organizations at the forefront of trying to help families be in the kind of housing that they deserve, that's going to enable them to live the kind of lives that we all want here in New York City. So thank you to everyone who's working so hard every day. I know it's not easy, but it's so vital. We are setting ourselves up to have, unfortunately, a growing crisis over time. We all know that New York City has not been developing the kind of affordable housing that it's needed for years and years. And one of the results of that is almost 60,000 people in our sheltering system and an additional at least 4,000 people who are on our streets. And the real number is likely significantly higher than that. There's a multiplier of 4.5 for every 12 months. So it might be as high as 15 or even 18,000 on our streets. So what can we do about it now? The first thing I believe is we have to keep the crisis from getting any worse, which is one reason I support the moratorium on evictions. We cannot be kicking people out of their homes during this time. And then when there are families in our sheltering system, one thing that we have done a good job of, or a relatively good job, is that, if there's a family that needs shelter in New York City, we provide that to them, though the shelter system itself has many deficiencies, that they're not as hospitable or well monitored as they could be. And the stays are getting 30% longer, which is not anything anyone should want. I mean, these shelters are not designed for someone to be there long term. So one of the things that just today I was tweeting about it, I suppose, is a plan to try and increase the level of value of the voucher system so that it actually can help people move to a home here in New York. And right now those vouchers aren't at high enough levels. So I would rate our system as doing its best, given that it's been set up to have a crisis that unfortunately is going to go worse over time.
When you say that it's not hospitable, what do you mean, and what exactly would a Yang administration do to change that? Are you talking about it just not being welcoming, or are you talking about shelter conditions?
Well, the sheltering conditions, from what I've seen and heard, are uneven. And there are some people that have said that they've had negative experiences in the shelter environments, which is not what you want to hear from families. One thing that I think would be extraordinarily helpful is to have specific shelters for victims of domestic violence who are often fleeing from an abusive partner, and it's a distinct population with distinct needs, and they should have a separate facility or place that's able to serve those.
There are already a number of domestic violence shelters. People talk about capacity issues with domestic violence shelters, but they do already exist.
Oh no, of course they do exist. So that's one aspect of something that we should be increasing capacity of. There are a lot of things we should be increasing capacity of. Psych beds is another example. I saw the number of psych beds in New York City has declined by 14% over the last number of years, while the needs have skyrocketed. And I just saw, as you probably did too, Courtney, that there are these transition centers that were funded by the de Blasio administration that are not being utilized, that are at least intended for people who are struggling with mental illness, some of which overlaps with the homeless population. So the sheltering conditions, again, these aren't intended to be long-term habitats for anyone. And so the goal should be to try and get the average stay down and the quality up, given that these are environments that are housing tens of thousands of people.
One of the problems facing families who are experiencing homelessness and have been staying in shelter for a period of time is obviously many of those families include school-age children. And we saw this year during the pandemic how difficult it was for children in shelter to get an education just because they didn't even have Wi-Fi, they couldn't connect. Students in shelter have had the lowest attendance rate of any student group this year, with attendance well below the citywide rate. And even before the pandemic, more than half of students in shelter were chronically absent, missing at least 1 out of 10 days of school. This is a story I've heard from families for years now, that children end up being chronically absent. If elected mayor, what would you do to improve the attendance rates of students in shelter to ensure they get to school on a regular basis?
This is something I'm very passionate about, Courtney, as a public school parent myself. And you're, of course, right that the truancy or the lack of attendance among kids in our sheltering system is way too high. But if you look at our city schools right now, over 50% of our kids aren't in school at present. And I believe that that's something that we have to be determined to help change come the fall. I mean, right now it's mid-May, it's almost Memorial Day. And so there's going to be a sense like, well, at some point it'll be summer and then school will be out anyway. But we have to be very, very clear-eyed about what we're going to be reopening to in the fall, where right now there are many families that still don't have any visibility as to whether schools will be open, what the standards will be. And so I think we need to set a very, very clear vision that we want kids back in school. And then at that point, if we accomplish that, then we need to go to the families in the shelters and make sure that their kids are in school too, because these are often kids that can least afford to be missing school and missing the opportunities and hopefully the education that they need to get on a positive path.
Do you think that going and ensuring these kids get to school, is that just about outreach, or is that about making sure the buses run on time? Some of these kids are placed in a shelter really far away, and then their school is an hour-and-a-half bus ride away. What do you think specifically is the solution there?
Well, we have to provide them the support that they need. And if that's a bus that's going to take them across town to school, that's what we should be providing. We can't leave it in a family's hands, because if you're in a shelter that could be 45 minutes, an hour away from where your school is, then leaving it to you to figure it out, is going to lead to chronic absence and other issues. And again, I'm a public school parent. I experience some aspects of this, and I'm fortunate enough where there's a bus that comes by, and we're able to put our child on that bus. And there's no reason why someone in a shelter shouldn't have that same level of access.
I believe we have a question now from a client, Heidi Kinney, who is staying at a WIN supportive housing facility in Brooklyn, I believe.
I'm having trouble hearing.
Yeah, we can't hear it. I think you maybe unmute. Yeah. Thank you for catching it before me. Let's see. Maybe unmute yourself.
My name is Heidi Kinney. I'm 43 years old, and I live in supportive housing in Brooklyn with my 3 children. The next mayor of New York City must be a leader for everyone, but it often feels like families in a shelter are forgotten. Many shelters aren't prepared or equipped to help children with special needs or adults battling diseases like Alzheimer's or dementia. My son is autistic. We moved into supportive housing. We had many difficulties while living in a shelter. As mayor, what will you do to help families like mine?
Well, this question feels very close to home for me, because one of my boys is autistic as well, and has been getting special services and resources since he was diagnosed now a bit more than 4 years ago. So I feel this mom's pain and needs very deeply, where when your kid's not getting what he or she needs, nothing else seems to matter. And I've seen my son regress at times, certainly during the pandemic, when he was not getting these sorts of services. And it's really difficult and heartbreaking. So one of the things I'm very happy to commit to as mayor is a significant level of investment in the resources available to parents of special needs children and the children themselves, obviously. I want to make New York City a real hub of support and innovation in terms of services for special needs families. What I say is special needs is the new normal. There are tens of thousands of parents in the same boat that she is describing, maybe not in the sheltering system, but certainly throughout New York City. And we can do much more for families who are in need of these resources, and it will pay off, because when these kids get what they need, they do develop much more positively. And if you can imagine the value gulf between having someone who is mentally healthy and educated and off to college and jobs and whatnot, and then someone who may need services the rest of their life, that's an enormous value difference. If you were to measure it out over the course of a life, it's, I'm sure, hundreds of thousands of dollars or more. So making that kind of investment in a child makes sense on a human level, but it also makes sense on an economic level over time.
I want to segue back to something that you had mentioned in your earlier remarks, and that is the housing voucher issue. You had said that you do in fact increase supporting or increasing the cost of the voucher. Specifically, how much do you think that voucher should be worth? And then more generally, the housing affordability issue in the city has really plagued the shelter system for so long. You mentioned yourself that people are staying longer. They're staying upwards of 400 days. That shouldn't be normal. That shouldn't be what we all expect to happen when you enter shelter. So in addition to the voucher issue, how do you get people to transition to permanent housing in a faster, more efficient way?
Well, the opportunity in the voucher, we should be truing it up to around the Section 8 level, which would be a significant increase in many cases. And there are two issues that landlords have with our current vouchers. One is the value is not high enough, but two, that they find it administratively difficult to deal with. So they're like, this is not what I want. Like, you know, the level's not high enough. It's too much of a hassle. So we have to try and address both of those things to make sure the voucher system actually can get someone out of, you know, one environment into a permanent home. That's the goal, again, that will save us money, because right now, having people in our sheltering system is very costly. So if we can get the stays down, it's a wise investment. It's one of the saving graces and opportunities here in New York, is that by making investments in some places, it's very prudent and wise in others. There was a second component to your question, Courtney.
Which is, in addition to the increase of the vouchers, how do you ensure that people not only, the shelter stay is smaller or is not as long as it is now, and how do you stop kind of the cycle of reoccurring homelessness, which you see? I mean, I've interviewed people who were in shelter 5 years ago, and then they end up coming back, and that has to do with the inability to find long-term permanent housing that's affordable.
Well, over the medium term, we need to build more affordable housing. And I proposed a very ambitious investment in that of $4 billion per year and 30,000 new or preserved units per year, which would start to make a dent. I mean, even that won't make it, won't address the need immediately. So that's one thing that we can do over the long haul. In the short term, it is around trying to take advantage of some of like the vacant buildings that we have and try and convert them as quickly as possible. So we've been using hotels as a stopgap. Now, the issue with the hotels right now is that they're being treated as a stopgap, and we need to figure out what structures can actually be converted into housing ongoing, and then have that be a more longstanding solution instead of something that we all see as you know, monthly or a stopgap. And the biggest need, and it's challenging because some of these buildings are not a good fit for it. But even as I'm championing folks coming back to the office, we do need to face facts that we're going to have vacant office buildings all over the city. And there are some Class B office buildings that I think can and should be converted into housing stock as quickly as we can, because even if we do come back in a really robust way, I think organizations' work habits are going to be altered forever in a way that's going to free up a lot of space. And the last thing you want is tons of empty buildings all over New York City, and a crushing need on this side for housing and affordable housing on the other.
I think we only have about 1 or 2 minutes left, so I want to make sure we get that final question from the client from Brooklyn, Heidi. Can we cue that up quickly? And then this will be the last question, and then we'll let you go.
My family and I lived in a shelter before we were able to move into supportive housing. I know what it's like to be in the city's shelter system and working to find a way forward. That's why I'm a peer advocate. I now help families in the shelter system to get access to programs that can help them out. At WIN, they have case managers in the shelter who help with everything from signing up for healthcare to working with a housing counselor. If you're selected as mayor of New York City, what will you do to make sure that the families who are in the shelter system get the support they that they need to access the shelter and do not have to return.
It's somewhat of a similar question that I just asked, but if you could just address her question as well, that would be great.
I think Heidi's experience itself is instructive in that she went from the shelter to supportive housing, which we need to build a lot more of. I think supportive housing is one of the great solutions and sources of long-term confidence that if someone's in supportive housing, that they're not going to return to shelter, certainly if they're getting the support that they need. And her experience as a peer advocate, trying to help people get access to these services. We have to make our city services easier to navigate for people generally, but certainly having someone like Heidi steward you through it would be enormously helpful for tons of people. And so those two things I think are really powerful and instructive. And certainly the last thing you'd want is for someone to go from the sheltering system to an environment that doesn't work for them and then back into the sheltering system. I'm passionate about building as much supportive housing as we can, as quickly as we can. And it's been one of the costs of the mayor and the governor not being on the same page, because a lot of the resources for supportive housing have flowed from Albany and the state. And that flow has been somewhat bottlenecked by the fact that the governor and the mayor haven't been working well together. We need to change that. And as mayor, I see my relationship with the governor or the people in Albany as something that I have to have in order to deliver for the people of New York City. So there'll be zero political point scoring out of me. It'll just be trying to get things done.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it, taking the time to talk about this issue. And
thank you, Courtney.
We'll see you on the campaign trail.
See you soon. Okay. Bye, everybody.
Right. Bye. I believe that ends the candidate portion of tonight's forum, or this morning's forum. Obviously, it's been a long time on the campaign trail. I don't know what time of day it is anymore, or what day it is actually. So my part is over. So I'm gonna hand it back to Chris.
If any of you see Courtney on the street, give her water or coffee. These last 5 weeks are the worst. I know, I've been there. So she needs our support. Courtney, thank you very much for moderating. You know this issue so well. You really made sure the candidates gave full answers that were specific and couldn't just, not that a candidate would ever do that, gloss over the top. I want to thank our two clients. They were the most important questioners and really put a full perspective on what life in shelter is like with children and how important supportive housing is. I want to thank Maya and Kathryn and Andrew for joining us today. And we heard good things from these three candidates. We've heard broad-based support for Intro 146, the piece of legislation to raise the FHEPS voucher to the Section 8 level. And I want to say that every mayoral candidate has supported that piece of legislation, but we're not going to wait till the next mayor. We're going to get it done so they can implement it. We heard commitments to trauma-informed care, commitments to make the services in shelter better and more specific. We heard great commitments to making affordable housing really affordable, because the first plan Mayor de Blasio had didn't have one unit that was affordable to somebody who was exiting shelter. These commitments and more really will put us in a better place as it relates to our efforts to end family homelessness. But let's be clear, we didn't hear everything we wanted. We didn't hear enough specifics, and we didn't hear a deep enough understanding, in my opinion, about what needs to be happening in shelter for the time people are there. So I think today was a great step forward, but there is more work to do in the next 5 weeks, in the time between the primary on June 22nd, write it down, and the general, between the general and January 1st, and January 1st when the new mayor takes office. So thank you all for caring about the families of New York City. Thank you for caring about the homeless children of New York City. Thank you for looking and seeing those families that so many people turn away from every day. I know with the support of New Yorkers, with the interest of the media, with keeping pressure on candidates and electeds, we can end the family homeless crisis in the very near future. So I wish you all a good day out in sunny New York and a great weekend. And hopefully I will see many of you soon in our service and advocacy work. Take care.